Imagine waking up tomorrow and the government just announces that the language you speak is suddenly wrong.
Right, just completely invalid.
Exactly. The alphabet you use to write your name, that's been replaced. The borders of your town have been completely redrawn by someone sitting at a desk, 2,000 miles away.
It's just wild to even think about.
And your very identity, like how you define your heritage, your ethnicity, it has just been categorized into this brand new box that you've never even heard of.
Yeah, a box that didn't exist yesterday.
Right. And for millions of people across Central Asia and the Caucasus in the 20th century, that wasn't some dystopian hypothetical. That was just a Tuesday.
It really was. It's the ultimate bureaucratic nightmare.
Yeah.
And it was carried out on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend today.
Seriously impossible.
We like to think of maps and borders as these ancient, organic, permanent things. But the reality is that the geopolitical landscape of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Afghanistan over the last 100 years was essentially drawn in dry erase marker.
Dry erase marker. I love that.
Well, it was. By empires desperately trying to force their own versions of the future onto these deeply traditional societies.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. And to you, our listener, a massive thank you. You have provided us with an incredible stack of historical research detailing the sheer, unadulterated turbulence of these regions throughout the 20th century.
It's quite the stack.
It really is. Our mission today is to sift through this mountain of source material, to understand how 9 decades of collapsing empires, completely arbitrary borders, and some of the most radical, aggressive social engineering in human history completely reshaped the faiths, the identities, and the futures of the people living there.
It is a massive undertaking, but to set the stage for you, it really helps to understand the unifying thread here.
Right, because they seem so different on the surface.
Exactly. Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Afghanistan might seem geographically and culturally distinct to an outsider. But in the 20th century, they share this profoundly tragic narrative arc. They were all subjected to intense, top-down attempts to force, quote-unquote, modernity upon them.
Whoever's version of modernity that happened to be.
Right. Sometimes this was driven by Soviet communists expanding an ideological empire from Moscow. Other times it was driven by ambitious local kings in Kabul trying to emulate European nation-states.
Just completely different ideologies?
Totally different. But regardless of who was issuing the decrees, these grand experiments almost always collided violently with the complex, deeply rooted realities on the ground.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand how the map gets rewritten, we have to look at the spark that incinerated the old one. We have to rewind to World War I.
The great catalyst.
Yeah, because when you think of the First World War, you instinctively think of the trenches in France, right? You think of the Somme or Gallipoli. You don't necessarily think of nomadic herders in the Central Asian steppes.
No, most people definitely don't.
But the sheer gravitational pull of that distant conflict dragged these relatively isolated regions right into the modern geopolitical meat grinder.
It acted as an absolute catalyst for upheaval. And to understand the mechanics of this, you have to look at the massive structural strain the Russian Empire was under at the time.
They were just falling apart, weren't they?
Completely. By 1916, Russia is bleeding out on the Eastern Front. Their industrial capacity is failing, but more importantly, their transport and logistical networks are nearing total collapse.
Just a disaster on every level.
Right. They needed food, they needed supplies, and they needed raw physical labor just to keep the war machine functioning. So the imperial government turns to its vast territories in Central Asia and the Caucasus.
Territories they had spent decades colonizing and heavily taxing, I might add.
Exactly. Which brings us to a really fascinating contradiction in the research you provided.
Oh, this part blew my mind. For decades prior to this, the Russian government explicitly viewed Central Asians and Muslim Caucasians as, quote, too alien to actually serve in the Tsar's army.
Yeah, they didn't trust them with weapons at all.
Right. They didn't view them as true citizens of the empire, but desperation is an incredible motivator, By 1916, the Tsar is hemorrhaging manpower, so the empire completely reverses course and drafts 250,000 of these men.
250,000 men.
Yeah, and not even to fight, but to perform grueling support roles, digging trenches, and moving supplies behind the lines.
And we really need to dig into why this specific draft order detonated the region. Because it wasn't just the fact that they were being conscripted.
Right. It's never just one thing.
No. It was the fact that the draft was dropping onto a society already pushed to the absolute brink of starvation.
This is the part that is just so heartbreaking.
It really is. For years, Russian officials had been systematically seizing the most fertile grazing lands, particularly from the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, and handing them over to Russian peasant settlers.
Which is just devastating. And on top of that, the state was heavily requisitioning livestock and transport carts for the war effort. And I want to pause on that because it's so crucial for our listener to grasp. If you are a nomadic pastoralist on the steppe, your livestock and your carts aren't just, like, property. They are your entire mechanism for survival.
Exactly. They are your lifeblood.
Without your horses and carts, you cannot migrate between seasonal pastures. Your herds die, and then you die. So the Tsar is effectively issuing a death sentence before the drafted men even leave for the front.
Precisely. And the timing, the timing couldn't have been worse. The region had just suffered through a brutal winter that decimated their herds naturally.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So when the decree came down in the summer of 1916, demanding those 250,000 men, the population simply snapped. It sparked a massive, sprawling, uncoordinated uprising. Nomads attacked Russian settler villages, telegraph lines were cut, and administrative outposts were burned.
And before we get into the imperial response, I think it's really important to add a quick note here on impartiality. As we discuss the violence during this uprising, and really throughout this entire deep dive, we are simply reporting on the historical events and the realities of violence between Russian settlers, Bolsheviks, and indigenous tribes exactly as they're documented in the source material.
Absolutely.
We aren't endorsing any side's actions, just presenting the historical facts you provided us to understand how this region was shaped.
Right. It's just about understanding the history.
Yeah.
And the imperial response to that uprising was utterly draconian. The Tsar's military didn't just suppress the rebels, they armed the local Russian settlers and essentially greenlit a campaign of indiscriminate violence against the indigenous populations.
It's just horrific. The numbers documented in the source material are staggering. In the ensuing violence, it is estimated that perhaps 1/3 of the entire Kazakh population perished. 1/3. Let that sink in. And another 300,000 desperate people gathered whatever they had left and fled across the mountains into China, where they faced even more starvation and hardship.
And the tragedy doesn't end with the suppression of the revolt, because immediately following this, the Russian monarchy collapses entirely in 1917.
Right. Kicking off the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War.
Exactly. And the entire logistical network of the empire shatters. Grain deliveries to Central Asia, which the region now desperately relied on because they had been forced to grow cotton for Russian factories, simply stopped.
They couldn't even feed themselves.
No. Between 1917 and 1922, a horrific famine swept the region. The sources estimate that between 1 and 3 million Central Asians died.
1 to 3 million. Because of this perfect storm of imperial exploitation, a distant war, and a total collapse of infrastructure.
It's almost unimaginable.
Now, while the North is descending into this apocalyptic famine and civil war, the shockwaves of World War I are hitting Afghanistan to the south in a very different way.
Very different.
It's 1919, the Afghan emir is assassinated, and his third son, Aman Allah, seizes the throne. And the very first thing he does is look at a British empire that has just been exhausted by 4 years of global war, and he essentially says, now is our chance.
He saw an opening.
He really did. He launches a brief, bold military campaign against British India to secure total foreign policy independence.
It was a brilliantly timed maneuver. The Third Anglo-Afghan War was militarily inconclusive, but politically it was a massive victory for Aman Allah.
Thus he forced their hand.
Exactly. By forcing the British to relinquish control over Afghanistan's foreign affairs, he earned immense domestic and international prestige. He was hailed as a Ghazi, a Muslim warrior who had struck a blow against a major imperial power. He dropped the title of emir and declared himself Shah, or king.
Right. He positions himself as this global champion of Islamic independence. He starts sending diplomatic support to anti-British movements in India, and he publicly supports the Basmachi.
The Basmachi.
Yeah, the decentralized Muslim guerrilla fighters who were desperately trying to fight off the Red Army up in Central Asia. On the surface, Aman Allah looks like a visionary leader capitalizing on a shifting world order. It's like a distant earthquake triggering a massive tsunami, you know? The main war is in Europe, but the tidal wave of consequences completely drowns the old order in Asia.
That is a great way to put it.
But looking at the sources, I have to ask you, did Aman Allah's bold move actually stabilize Afghanistan, or did it just set it up for a harder fall? Because reading this, it feels like he's writing checks his country's infrastructure just can't cash.
You've hit the nail on the head. His external glory completely masked fatal internal vulnerabilities. He positioned himself as the great patron of the Basmachi resistance in Central Asia, but he rarely delivered the actual military aid he promised them.
Because he didn't have it.
Exactly, largely because he didn't have it to give. His army was underfunded, his administration was fragile, and his entire grand strategy relied on a unified Afghan identity that didn't actually exist yet.
Because at this exact moment, the dust of the old empires is settling. In the north, the Bolsheviks have won the Civil War and are consolidating the new Soviet Union. In the south, Aman Allah has his fully independent Afghanistan.
Right.
And both of these new regimes look at their vast, diverse, multi-ethnic, highly traditional territories and realize they have a massive problem. How do you build a modern state out of people who don't even agree on what a nation is?
Because the very concept of a nation-state is a relatively modern European invention. I mean, if you asked a farmer in the Fergana Valley in 1920 what his nationality was, the question wouldn't even make sense to him.
He'd look at you like you were crazy.
Totally. He might identify by his tribe, his lineage, his specific town, or his religion as a Muslim. The idea that he was inherently part of a bounded ethno-national group was completely foreign. So the Bolsheviks decided to artificially construct those groups. They rolled out a policy known as Korenizatsiya, or indigenization.
And the sheer bureaucratic audacity of this policy is just mind-blowing.
It really is.
The Soviet leadership, sitting in Moscow, decides they need to categorize millions of people. I'm trying to imagine being a Soviet census taker in the 1920s, you know? You ride out to a nomadic encampment on the steppe, and you have a form that requires you to check a box for nationality.
A box that they have to fit into.
Right. The people there might speak a Turkic dialect, but they also use Persian words, and they identify as part of the Kipchak Tribal Confederation. And the bureaucrat just has to look at them and say, congratulations, Moscow has decided you are now officially Kazakh.
It was an incredibly messy, highly politicized process. The ideological justification in Moscow, championed by Lenin, was summed up by the slogan, National Inform, Socialist in Content.
What does that actually mean in practice, though?
Well, the Bolsheviks knew they were viewed with deep suspicion as Russian imperialists wearing new socialist coats. They believed that if they carved out specific, recognized republics for these populations, a Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, an Uzbek SSR, a Turkmen SSR, and allowed them to be governed by local cadres speaking local languages, the populations would be much more receptive to communist ideology.
But drawing the lines between these groups was virtually impossible.
Oh, absolutely impossible.
Because centuries of trade, intermarriage, and shared religion meant the cultures were entirely blended. Like, take the Uzbek identity, for example. The sources show that Moscow arbitrarily decided to apply the label Uzbek to the sedentary, non-tribal, town-dwelling people of southern Central Asia.
Right.
But historically, the original Uzbeks were nomadic Turkic tribes who conquered the region centuries earlier. So the Soviets took the name of the ancient conquerors and slapped it onto the descendants of the people they conquered just to create a neat bureaucratic category.
It makes no logical sense historically. And once you create these categories, you have to draw physical borders around them, which immediately triggered massive political infighting.
Obviously.
Look at the city of Tashkent. It was a major economic hub. The city itself had a large population that the Soviets had just designated as Uzbek, but the surrounding countryside was heavily populated by people designated as Kazakh.
Oh boy. So who gets it?
Well, both the newly formed Uzbek and Kazakh political elites lobbied Moscow fiercely for control of the city. Ultimately, Moscow handed it to Uzbekistan, leaving a massive Kazakh population completely cut off from what they considered their economic center.
And as deeply disruptive as drawing lines on a map is, the Soviets went even further. They didn't just map the land, they tried to remap the human mind.
They really did.
They initiated one of the most chillingly effective campaigns of cultural control I've ever encountered in our research: the weaponization of the alphabet.
It is a profound example of how you can sever a society from its own history without firing a single shot.
Let me walk through the timeline on this, because the whiplash is intense for anyone living through it. For centuries, the literate populations in these regions used the Arabic script, largely because of the deep ties to Islam and the Persian literary tradition.
Yes.
Then in the 1920s, there was actually a grassroots movement led by intellectuals in Azerbaijan to adopt a modified Latin alphabet. They viewed it as a step towards secular modernity, and the Soviets actually encouraged this at first.
They did, for a brief window.
But by the 1930s, Stalin's paranoia is peaking. He views the Latin alphabet as a bridge to the outside world, specifically to Turkey, which had just adopted Latin under Ataturk. Stalin doesn't want his Soviet Muslims looking toward Ankara. So by 1939, Moscow mandates yet another shift. Every Turkic language in Tajik must now be written in the Russian Cyrillic alphabet.
That is 3 distinct writing systems forced upon a population in less than 20 years.
3 alphabets in 1 generation.
And here is the truly insidious mechanism behind that final shift to Cyrillic. They did not simply issue a standard Cyrillic alphabet for everyone to use.
Wait, they didn't?
No. Soviet linguists deliberately assigned completely different Cyrillic characters to represent the exact same sounds in different Central Asian languages.
It's like they updated the operating system on an entire culture just to make the old files unreadable. But wait, why go to the trouble of making the new operating systems incompatible with each other?
To permanently fracture any potential for pan-Turkic unity.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly. If a Kazakh and a Kyrgyz are speaking to each other, they can largely understand each other. But if you make sure their newspapers and books use entirely different alphabets, you make it artificially exhausting for them to consume each other's media.
It's so dark.
You isolate the nationalities in their own little linguistic silos, completely dependent on Russian as the only bridge between them. Furthermore, by changing the alphabet twice in a generation and combining that with massive state-sponsored book burnings of old Arabic texts, you essentially guarantee that a child born in 1940 cannot read the poetry, the history, or the theological texts written by their own grandfather.
It is total historical erasure.
Total.
That is just horrifyingly efficient. But while the Soviets were using bureaucracy and linguistics to slice their empire into smaller boxes down in Afghanistan, the state was attempting its own version of identity engineering using a very different strategy.
Yes, Afghanistan, under the Musahiban dynasty king Nadir Shah, who took power in 1929, and his successors, they faced the exact same problem. A fractured, multi-ethnic, highly tribal society that didn't naturally see itself as a unified nation.
But instead of creating separate republics for the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks, the Afghan monarchy decided to go all in on Pashtun nationalism.
Right, a totally different approach.
They decided that to be truly Afghan, you had to be culturally molded in the image of the Pashtun tribes. They made Pashto an official state language alongside Dari Persian in 1936. They actively promoted historical narratives emphasizing a shared Aryan racial lineage to tie the country together.
And crucially, they heavily subsidized the powerful Pashtun tribes in the south at the direct expense of the non-Pashtun ethnic groups in the North and Central Highlands.
It's a fascinating contrast.
It is. The Soviet approach was to divide and manage, while the Afghan approach was to elevate one specific ethnic core and attempt to assimilate everyone else into it. But both strategies share the exact same underlying arrogance. They believe that identity is just clay, that the state can mold at will.
And here's where it gets really interesting, which is the tragic irony of this entire era. Because the sources make it explicitly clear, in their desperate attempts to unify and control their populations, both regimes actually cemented the deep-seated ethnic grievances, the resentments, and the hyper-awareness of identity that would eventually tear these regions apart in brutal civil wars decades later.
Yes.
I mean, when you tell people their survival depends on which ethnic box they belong to, they are going to defend that box with their lives.
Exactly. And once a state believes it has successfully categorized its people, the inevitable next step is deciding how those people should live and work. Identity engineering is just the prerequisite for economic and social engineering.
And that leads us to some of the darkest chapters in this research, because in the late 1920s, Joseph Stalin consolidates absolute power in Moscow, and he decides that the Soviet Union must industrialize immediately, regardless of the human cost. For the rural populations of Central Asia, this meant forced collectivization.
To understand the magnitude of this disaster, you have to understand the logic of nomadism. For centuries, the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz survived the harsh environment of the steppe by constantly moving their herds to seasonal pastures.
It was a whole ecosystem.
It was an incredibly finely tuned ecological balance, and Stalin's collectivization decrees demanded that these nomads instantly abandon their way of life, settle into permanent state-run collective farms, and hand over their herds and grain to the government.
It's essentially telling a sailor to suddenly become a desert farmer. The psychological and economic shock is just total.
Total shock.
And the Cossacks didn't just passively accept this. They recognized it as a death sentence, and they resisted with absolute fury. If the state was going to take their herds, they decided the state would get nothing. The sources detail how families systematically slaughtered their own sheep, horses, and camels. They burned their own grain stores. It was a scorched earth resistance against an impossible policy.
And the Soviet state responded by doubling down, enforcing grain requisition quotas even when there was literally nothing left to eat. When you combine the mass slaughter of the herds with the total ineptitude of the Soviet administrators managing the new collective farms, and then add in a period of severe weather, the result is an apocalyptic famine.
Just a perfect storm of misery.
By the early 1930s, the Cossack steppe was quite literally a graveyard.
The numbers in the research are devastating. It's estimated that 1.5 million Kazakhs perished, mostly from starvation and disease, but also from direct violence as they fought Soviet requisition squads.
Yeah, 1.5 million people.
The death toll, combined with hundreds of thousands fleeing into China, fundamentally altered the demographics of the region. The Soviets simultaneously poured hundreds of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian settlers into Kazakhstan to build industrial centers and gulags. By the end of this period, the Kazakhs were actually a minority in their own republic.
It is a textbook example of ideological doctrine completely overriding basic physical reality.
Yeah.
And while the nomads were being sedentarized, the sedentary farmers of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan were being subjected to a different kind of horror, which was the cotton monoculture.
The cotton curse.
Yes, exactly.
Moscow realized that to fuel their textile industry and gain independence from foreign markets, they needed an endless supply of cheap cotton. So they ordered the complete reorganization of Central Asian agriculture. Farmers were forced to rip out their food crops, their orchards, their traditional varied agriculture, and plant nothing but cotton.
And cotton is an incredibly thirsty, demanding crop. To meet the ever-increasing, completely unrealistic production quotas set by Moscow, local administrators had to resort to desperate measures.
They just did whatever it took.
Right. They began diverting massive amounts of water from the region's rivers, a practice that would eventually lead to one of the world's worst ecological disasters, like the draining of the Aral Sea. But even in the short term, the human cost was staggering. To force the yields higher, the Soviets dumped astronomical amounts of chemical fertilizers, defoliants, and pesticides onto the fields.
And the peasants, men, women, and children were forced into those fields with their bare hands to harvest the cotton, breathing in those toxic chemicals year after year.
It's awful.
The sources note massive spikes in infant mortality, respiratory diseases, and cancers. Central Asia was essentially turned into a massive, highly toxic plantation designed solely to extract wealth for the imperial center, all disguised beneath the rhetoric of socialist modernization.
And this brings us back to a crucial theme. Modernization in this era almost never meant improving the lives of the people. It meant making the people legible and useful to the state. We see this exact same dynamic playing out in Afghanistan under Amanullah, though with slightly different motivations.
Right. Because Amanullah isn't a communist, but he is desperately trying to build a modern European-style nation-state. He issues 76 nizamnamas, which are these broad administrative regulations touching on almost every aspect of Afghan life.
Yeah.
And it's important to acknowledge that some of these were objectively progressive. In 1919, he officially abolishes slavery in Afghanistan, which specifically liberated the Hazara Shi population who had been subjugated by previous rulers.
Which was a massive deal.
Huge. That act alone earned him their enduring loyalty. He also banned the practice of forced labor.
Those were significant structural reforms.
Mm-hmm.
But Amanullah fundamentally lacked patience. He took a grand tour of Europe and the Middle East in 1927 and 1928. He visited Ataturk in Turkey and Reza Shah in Iran, both of whom were aggressively secularizing their countries.
And he just got swept up in it.
Completely. Amanullah returns to Kabul completely dazzled by what he saw, and he decides that Afghanistan needs to look like Europe immediately.
I was reading the details of this in the sources, and it reads like a tragicomedy. He literally passes laws trying to force Afghan men in Kabul to wear European-style suits and bowler hats.
Bowler hats in Kabul.
Bowler hats. And much more explosively, he attempts to mandate the unveiling of women and raises the legal age of marriage, doing this without any groundwork, without consulting the powerful tribal leaders, and without the military strength to actually enforce it outside the capital. I'm struggling to understand how Amanullah thought he could unveil women overnight in a deeply conservative, rural, patriarchal society without a massive revolt. Was he just entirely isolated from his own people?
He suffered from the classic delusion of the absolute monarch. He believed that issuing a decree was the exact same thing as changing reality.
Right.
He viewed the traditional clothing and customs not as deeply held cultural and religious values, but merely as singles of backwardness that could be stripped away by a royal command.
And this connects to a really fascinating sociological strategy used by both Amanullah and the Soviets, which your sources highlight. Both regimes actively weaponize women's liberation, using it as a political tool to break the power of traditional society.
Yes, the concept of the surrogate proletariat, particularly in the Soviet context. The Bolsheviks had a glaring ideological problem in Central Asia. Marxism dictates that the revolution must be led by the industrial working class, the proletariat.
Right. You need factory workers for a Marxist revolution.
Exactly. But in the 1920s in Central Asia, there were virtually no factories and no industrial working class. The society was overwhelmingly agrarian, led by religious clerics and tribal patriarchs. The Communist Party needed a mobilized class to overthrow that traditional order. Since they didn't have factory workers, they decided to substitute them with another oppressed demographic.
They decided women would be the vanguard of the revolution.
Exactly. The Soviet state launched massive, highly publicized campaigns called the Hujum, targeting veiling, the seclusion of women, traditional divorce laws, and polygamy. They encouraged women to publicly burn their veils, promising them the full protection and support of the Soviet state.
But the reality was horrifying. The state threw these women onto the absolute front lines of a cultural civil war, but provided almost none of the necessary safety nets.
None at all.
The backlash from the traditional patriarchal society was immediate and visceral. The sources document waves of horrific physical violence, ostracization, and murder directed against the women who actually tried to step forward and claim these new Soviet rights. Because the Soviet state hadn't actually dismantled the power structures of the villages, They just painted a target on the backs of the women.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation. And ironically, the heavy-handed nature of the Soviet attack on traditional practices actually transformed those practices. Before the Hujum, veiling was simply a cultural and religious norm.
Right.
After the Soviet attack, the veil became a powerful, deeply politicized symbol of national identity and resistance against Russian assimilation. By attacking it so aggressively, the Soviets actually entrenched it.
And we see a remarkably similar blowback in Afghanistan. Amanullah's rapid, forced modernization, particularly his decrees regarding women and secular education, alienated the powerful tribal leaders and the religious establishment. By 1929, the country is in open revolt.
It unraveled so fast.
Amanullah is forced to flee, and the throne is actually captured by a Tajik villager, a man named Habiballah Kalakani, better known as Batai Sakah, or the water carrier's son. He rides into Kabul under the banner of a holy jihad against the infidel king, rallying all the traditional forces Amanullah had alienated.
It is a stunning collapse, and Bachai Sakah rolls back nearly all of Amanullah's reforms immediately, shutting down the girls' schools and restoring traditional law.
So I have to ask, looking at the catastrophic failure of Soviet collectivization and Amanullah's decrees, did these modernization attempts fail because the societies themselves were simply too rigid and, as the empires claimed, backward to accept progress? Or did they fail because the implementation was just phenomenally arrogant?
The historical consensus, heavily supported by your sources, points entirely to the latter.
Okay, so it was arrogance.
Yes. The failure wasn't due to some inherent backwardness of the people. The failure was rooted in the state's staggering disregard for the lived reality of their citizens. You cannot violently uproot a society's entire economic mechanism, rewrite their language, and attack their foundational social structures overnight by decree. When a state views its people as an obstacle to be smashed rather than a constituency to be governed, the result is always catastrophe.
And you definitely cannot rewire society without attacking its spiritual core. Because if your goal is absolute control, you cannot tolerate the existence of a higher moral authority. Which brings us to how these regimes dealt with Islam.
The Soviet approach to Islam was a masterclass in opportunistic suppression. Immediately following the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks were fighting for their lives in the Civil War. They desperately needed the neutrality, if not the direct support, of the Muslim populations.
You needed to play nice for a minute.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So initially, they presented themselves as champions of religious freedom. They actually restored the waqfs, the vital religious endowments, usually land or property, that generated income to fund the mosques and the clerics. They allowed the traditional Sharia courts to operate alongside Soviet courts.
But the moment Stalin solidifies his grip on the apparatus of the state in the late 1920s, the illusion of tolerance just vanishes. They launch a campaign of total eradication.
Total.
And they do it systematically. First, they confiscate the waqfs again. And if you understand the mechanics of a waqf, you understand that this wasn't just a land grab, it was financial strangulation. Without the income from those endowments, the mosques can't pay their imams, and they can't fund the maktabs and madrasas, the primary and secondary religious schools.
Precisely. Once they bankrupted the religious infrastructure, they moved to physical destruction. They violently abolished the Sharia courts. They banned religious education. They physically closed or demolished thousands of mosques.
It's just staggering.
The statistics are chilling, honestly. By the outbreak of World War II in 1941, out of an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 mosques that had been functioning in Central Asia, only a tiny handful remained officially open. The religious scholars, the Sufi masters, the local imams, thousands of them were arrested, executed, or vanished into the Gulag system. The Soviet state attempted to rip Islam out of the society by the roots.
But then history throws a curveball. 1941 happens. Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union. The Red Army is suffering millions of casualties.
Right.
And Stalin, sitting in Moscow, realizes that he is facing an existential threat, and he needs every single Soviet citizen, including the millions of Muslims he just spent a decade terrorizing, to fight for the motherland. He needs them to view this not as a defense of communism, but as a patriotic, spiritual defense of their homes. So the policy pivots overnight from eradication to co-optation.
It is breathtaking cynicism. In 1943, Stalin authorizes the creation of the spiritual directorates. These were state-managed bureaucratic bodies, staffed by a carefully vetted, state-approved official clergy. Suddenly, a few mosques are allowed to reopen. A single, heavily monitored madrasa is allowed to train new clerics.
But there's a catch, right?
A massive one. This official Islam was entirely subservient to the state. The spiritual directorate issued fatwas, religious rulings that mysteriously aligned perfectly with whatever Moscow needed.
Ah, convenient.
Right. If the state needed higher cotton yields, the clerics would issue a fatwa declaring that fulfilling state agricultural quotas was a religious duty. They created a sanitized, hollowed-out version of the faith.
But what is so fascinating, and what speaks to the sheer resilience of the human spirit, is that true, deeply felt religious practice didn't die. It just became invisible to the state.
Yes, it went underground.
The sources detail the survival of folk Islam. The vast majority of the population ignored the state-sponsored clerics. Instead, informal networks of Sufi brotherhoods, wandering holy men, and clandestine unregistered clerics kept the faith alive in secret. They held prayers in private homes, they taught children the Quran in secret, and they maintained the spiritual life of the community entirely outside the panopticon of the Soviet state.
It was a profound, quiet resistance. Now, if we look south to Afghanistan during this same mid-century period, we see the monarchy playing a very different but equally dangerous game with religion.
Right. After the chaos of Amanullah and Machasaka, the Musahiban dynasty Nadir Shah and then his son Zahir Shah took control. And they learned from Amanullah's mistakes. They realized you cannot openly attack the religious establishment and survive.
No, you definitely can't.
So they explicitly use Islam to legitimize their rule. They write the Hanafite school of Sharia law directly into the Constitution. They publicly align themselves with the conservative rural clerics.
But if you look closely at their policies, it was largely a facade. While they paid lip service to Islamic law, their actual goal was to build a modern, secular, centralized state apparatus.
They just didn't want to say it out loud.
Exactly. They treated religion primarily as a set of useful rituals to keep the rural populations placated. Meanwhile, they actively marginalized traditional Islamic education. They poured all the state's resources into building secular, Western-style high schools and universities in Kabul, creating a new, secularly educated elite to run the government bureaucracy.
They wanted the aesthetics of Islam without its political constraints.
Precisely.
Both the Soviets and the Afghan royals essentially wanted the exact same thing: a domesticated religion that validated their authority and never challenged the state.
And that shared hubris, the absolute belief that a handful of men in a capital city can perfectly calibrate and control the spiritual core of millions of people, that is what planted the seeds for the massive, explosive religious revivals and extremist blowbacks that would define the late 20th century.
You cannot compress a spring forever, Yeah. Eventually the tension releases. And that brings us to the final, devastating act of our deep dive: The bill finally comes due.
Yes, it does.
Decades of arbitrary borders, suppressed religion, forced social changes, and extractive economies reach a boiling point. We move into the late 20th century, where these so-called buffer states become the epicenter of the Cold War, and the supposedly eternal Soviet Union shatters. Let's start with the explosion in Afghanistan.
To understand the Afghan jihad, you really have to look at the structural trap the Afghan state built for itself during the Cold War. In the 1950s and 60s, Prime Minister Dod Khan, who was a member of the royal family, was desperate to modernize the Afghan military and infrastructure. The U.S. was hesitant to provide massive military aid, so Dod turned to the Soviet Union.
He just opened the door to them.
Wide open. He took on astronomical loans, imported thousands of Soviet military advisors, and sent Afghan officers to Moscow for training.
He essentially mortgaged the country's independence for infrastructure. And the inevitable result of that deep Soviet infiltration is the growth of a domestic communist movement within the Afghan military and intellectual class.
Which leads to the coup.
Right. In 1978, the communist PDPA party stages a bloody coup and seizes control of Kabul. They immediately try to implement radical Soviet-style land reforms and aggressively secular policies in the countryside using extreme violence. The rural population instantly revolts, the communist government begins to collapse under the weight of the insurgency, and in December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to prop up their failing communist client.
And this invasion triggers a nationwide jihad. But it is vital to understand the composition of this resistance, the Mujahideen. It wasn't just the traditional rural tribal leaders reacting against foreign invaders. The intellectual core of their resistance was driven by a new generation of urban, educated Islamist youth.
This is a crucial point from the research. These young men had gone through the secular high schools and universities in Kabul, but many had also studied abroad in places like Egypt's Al-Azhar University. There, they were exposed to modern, highly politicized Islamist ideologies movements like the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
They came back to Afghanistan believing that the traditional, quietist clerics had failed the country and that Islam needed to be a revolutionary political force. When the Soviets invaded, these modern Islamists joined forces with the rural traditionalists, forming a massive, incredibly motivated insurgency.
And fueled by massive covert funding and weaponry from the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and others, this coalition bled the Red Army for a decade. The Soviet Union, the military superpower that defeated Nazi Germany, was bogged down in an unwinnable guerrilla war.
They just couldn't win.
By 1989, facing a collapsing economy at home, the Soviets were forced to undergo a humiliating withdrawal. The Afghan resistance fundamentally broke the aura of Soviet invincibility.
And the trauma of that war, combined with deep economic rot, proved fatal to the empire itself. Just 2 years after leaving Afghanistan, the entire Soviet Union collapses in 1991. Almost overnight, the map is rewritten again. The massive Soviet bloc shatters into 15 separate republics. The Central Asian and Caucasus republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and the rest are suddenly thrust into independence.
But if anyone, either locally or in the West, was expecting a sudden blossoming of democratic free market utopias, they were completely misreading the political realities on the ground.
Oh, this is one of the most mind-bending parts of the post-Soviet fallout. When the Soviet Union officially dissolved, who stepped up to lead these newly independent, supposedly liberated nations?
That's the best part.
It was the exact same men who had been running them from Moscow the day before. The former first secretaries of the Communist Party essentially walked into their offices, took down the portrait of Lenin, put up a new nationalist flag, and declared themselves presidents. You have Nursultan Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, Islam Karimov in Uzbekistan, Saparmurat Niyazov in Turkmenistan.
The faces didn't change at all. And more importantly, the underlying power structures didn't change. These men simply rebranded themselves. Yesterday, they were devout socialists, and today they were fierce ethnic nationalists.
Just a quick wardrobe change.
Exactly. They retained control of the state security apparatus, they crushed political opposition, and economically, they perpetuated the exact same extractive models that had impoverished their regions for decades.
Exactly. They didn't build diversified economies. Uzbekistan and Tajikistan remained utterly dependent on the environmentally catastrophic cotton monoculture. Kazakhstan, rather than developing domestic industry, banked entirely on extracting and exporting its massive natural resources, signing massive deals with Western oil companies to exploit the Kashagan oil field in the Caspian Sea. They just traded Moscow for the global commodity market.
And because this type of extractive economy concentrates massive wealth in the hands of a tiny elite while leaving the broader population in poverty, the leaders required extreme authoritarianism to maintain control. In some cases, this authoritarianism bordered on the surreal.
You mentioned Sapar Murat Niyazov in Turkmenistan. The cult of personality he built is staggering to read about. He renamed cities after himself. He renamed the months of the year after himself and his mother.
Yes.
But the most invasive aspect was his book, The Runama. He wrote this 2-volume text, which is a bizarre blend of autobiography, revised history, and spiritual guidance.
It was an attempt to completely overwrite the cultural and spiritual hard drive of the nation.
And he didn't just publish it and ask people to read it.
Yeah.
He wielded the full power of the state to force it into the minds of his citizens. He mandated that the Runama be treated as an object of sacred veneration. He forced imams to display his self-published book inside the mosques, physically placing it right next to the Quran.
It's unbelievable.
He required the clerics to quote from his book during their Friday sermons. Think about the psychological horror of that for a devout believer being forced by a dictator to elevate his political manifesto to the level of divine revelation under threat of imprisonment. It is the ultimate, final manifestation of the 20th century state trying to regulate the divine.
But that level of absolute suffocating control wasn't possible everywhere. In other parts of the former Soviet Empire, the sudden removal of Moscow's heavy hand didn't lead to stable dictatorships. It led to violent, explosive fracturing. The artificial borders and suppressed identities we discussed earlier finally tore open.
Which brings us back to our impartiality note for this section. The violence and the conflicts we are about to discuss in the 1990s are deeply tragic, and we are simply recounting the realities of human rights abuses and wars exactly as they are documented in the source material, without validating the ideological claims of any governments or insurgents.
Right, it's just about what the historical record shows. In Tajikistan, a devastating civil war erupted almost immediately in 1992. It was a vicious conflict primarily between the entrenched neo-communist elite trying to hold on to power and a diverse opposition coalition that importantly included the Islamic Rebirth Party, reflecting that long-suppressed religious identity finally demanding a voice in governance.
And then you look at the Caucasus, where the Soviet policy of drawing convoluted borders created ticking time bombs.
Absolute time bombs.
Nagorno-Karabakh was a primarily Armenian-populated enclave that Soviet bureaucrats had deliberately placed entirely within the borders of the Azerbaijan Soviet Republic. When Soviet Central Authority collapsed, the local Armenians demanded unification with Armenia, leading to an incredibly bloody, full-scale war between the newly independent states of Armenia and Azerbaijan, producing hundreds of thousands of refugees.
And then, perhaps most tragically, there is Chechnya. To understand the sheer ferocity of the Chechen conflict in the 1990s, you have to look backward. You have to understand the historical grievance that was seared into the Chechen consciousness.
Deportations.
Yes. In 1944, at the height of World War II, Joseph Stalin falsely accused the entire Chechen population of collaborating with the invading German army. As collective punishment, he ordered the mass deportation of the entire nation.
Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children were rounded up by the secret police at gunpoint, packed into unheated cattle cars, and shipped thousands of miles into the harsh steppes of Central Asia. Tens of thousands died of starvation, cold, and disease during the journey and the subsequent exile. They were not allowed to return to their homeland until the late 1950s.
So fast forward to 1991. The Soviet Union falls. The Chechen nationalists, carrying the memory of that near eradication, declare independence, viewing it as their one historical chance to escape Russian domination. But the new Russian Federation, under Boris Yeltsin, absolutely refuses to let the territory secede.
And so we get war.
In 1994, Russia launches a massive military invasion of Chechnya to crush the independence movement. The resulting war from 1994 to 1996 was characterized by indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, particularly the capital, Grozny.
It was just leveled.
The source material documents a staggering human cost. An estimated 50,000 civilian lives lost in a remarkably short period. The region's economy was completely destroyed, and society was severely traumatized.
And the result of that sheer devastation in Chechnya was profound radicalization. The initial secular nationalist movement was increasingly sidelined by hardened extremist factions who viewed the conflict not just as a war for independence, but as an existential religious struggle leading to a second, even more brutal war at the end of the decade.
It is the ultimate tragic legacy of a century of policies that treated human beings as disposable pawns on a geopolitical chessboard. When the empire finally weakened and let go, all the suppressed forces, all the historical traumas, and all the manipulated identities exploded outward.
It is an absolutely staggering amount of history we've navigated today.
It really is.
I mean, we've traced the spark of the Tsar drafting Central Asians to die in the logistical trenches of World War I. We've examined the surreal bureaucracy of Soviet census takers inventing nationalities and the chilling efficiency of bricking a culture's operating system by changing their alphabets.
3 times.
3 times. We've witnessed the apocalyptic tragedy of the Kazakh famine and the toxic legacy of the cotton curse. We've watched Afghan kings attempt to force their deeply traditional people into European suits by decree, and we've tracked the desperate, cynical attempts of massive empires to co-opt and regulate the very soul of Islam. All of this culminating in a modern geopolitical landscape that is still violently wrestling with the ghosts of these exact policies.
It is a dark history, but a deeply necessary one to understand.
And for you, our listener, I truly hope this deep dive has delivered on that bigger picture you were seeking when you compiled these sources. Because understanding the mechanics of this history, understanding how the borders were forced, how the religions were suppressed, and how the societies were engineered is the ultimate shortcut to making sense of the headlines you read today. When you see reports of border skirmishes in the Fergana Valley, or political unrest in the Caucasus, or the enduring complexities of Afghanistan, you now know why those fault lines exist. You know why identity, language, and faith are guarded with such fierce, uncompromising intensity. It isn't random violence. It is the entirely predictable outcome of a century spent living inside a historical pressure cooker.
And as we conclude, I'd like to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that emerges clearly when you step back and look at the totality of these sources. Throughout the entire 20th century, we saw some of the most massive, powerful, heavily armed states in human history attempt to simplify the complex peoples of these regions.
They really tried.
They tried to categorize them into neat, easily managed ethnic boxes. They tried to banish their ancient faiths to the shadows or hollow them out into state propaganda. And they tried to force them into foreign clothes, both literal and metaphorical, to make them appear modern. But rather than erasing these complex identities, the relentless pressure of state control actually achieved the exact opposite.
It backfired completely.
It forged those identities into something harder, more deeply rooted, and infinitely more resilient. It begs a profound question that continues to shape our world today. Does top-down social engineering ever actually change the fundamental soul of a society? Or does it merely teach a society how to hide its soul, preserving it in the dark until the empire finally falls?
That is exactly the kind of question that forces you to reevaluate everything you think you know about state power. To you, our listener, thank you again for handing over this incredibly dense, fascinating stack of research. It has been an absolute privilege exploring the mechanics of this history with you. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.